Have you ever wondered what makes someone run 1,000 miles in a wedding dress? What fear is greater than the unknown frontier? Before we begin this tale of love, redemption, and second chances, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Stay until the end to discover how a runaway bride became the mother a mute child needed, and comment your location below. Let's see how far this story of courage travels. Now let me tell you about the night Elizabeth Thornfield chose freedom over fortune. Runaway bride heals, sheriff's mute daughter. She fled fortune but found family in Wild West. The rain hammered against the church windows like desperate fists trying to break in or perhaps trying to break out. Elizabeth Thornfield stood frozen in the vestibule, her white satin wedding dress weighing her down like chains, listening to 500 guests chattering about her impending union to Theodore Blackwood. In 12 minutes, she would walk down that aisle. In 13 minutes, she would cease to exist as anything more than a wealthy man's possession. Her fingers found the letter hidden in her bodice, the one from her cousin Margaret in Wyoming Territory. There's work here for those willing to take it. The frontier doesn't care about your past, only your courage. Thunder cracked overhead, and Elizabeth made her choice. She slipped through the side door into the storm, her wedding dress instantly soaked, the delicate fabric clinging and pulling as she ran. Behind her, the church bells began to ring, calling her to her fate. She ran faster, her white satin shoes splitting on the cobblestones, her veil tearing away in the wind. The train station loomed ahead through sheets of rain, and there a freight train, steam hissing, preparing to depart. Elizabeth hauled herself into an open cargo car just as the train lurched forward. She collapsed against wooden crates, breathing hard water streaming from her ruined dress. As Philadelphia disappeared into the darkness behind her, she pulled the small medical bag from beneath her skirts, the only thing she'd managed to take from her old life. Inside were her father's surgical instruments, the ones he'd trained her with before drink took him, before debts forced her toward Theodore Blackwood's altar. "Never again," she whispered to the darkness. "Never again will I be someone's property." 3 weeks later, the train wheezed to a stop in Redemption Falls, Wyoming Territory. Elizabeth had traded her wedding dress for a simple brown traveling dress from a kind woman in Kansas, but she still felt the ghost of white satin on her skin. The platform was nearly empty in the pre-dawn darkness, just a few oil lamps fighting against the October cold. She'd meant to find her cousin Margaret, but the address led to a burned-out boarding house. The owner of the general store, a pinched woman named Mrs. Pritchard, informed her with barely concealed satisfaction that Margaret had died of fever 6 months prior. "You got any money for a room?" Mrs. Pritchard asked, eyeing Elizabeth's worn dress. "I have skills. I'm a trained nurse. Surely someone needs. This ain't Philadelphia, miss. We don't have much call for fancy Eastern medicine here." Elizabeth stood on the wooden sidewalk, her medical bag growing heavy in her hand, watching the sun rise over the harsh landscape. She had 43 cents, no food, no shelter, and winter was coming. For the first time since fleeing her wedding, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. That's when she heard the child screaming. Sheriff Jack Morrison knew the exact moment his life had ended, October 15th, 1879. That's when Sarah had taken her last breath, her hand going slack in his, while 7-year-old Lucy watched from the doorway, her mother's name dying on her lips, along with her voice. 3 years had passed since then. 3 years of Lucy's silence, of her dark drawings, of her flinching away from any woman who tried to mother her. This morning was no different. Lucy sat at the kitchen table drawing with the charcoal pencils he'd bought from a traveling merchant. Another picture of shadows and darkness, stick figures lying still, while a small girl stood alone. "Lucy, sweetheart, you need to eat something." She didn't look up, just pushed the eggs around her plate. Jack rubbed at his face, feeling every one of his 35 years. He'd fought in the war, tracked outlaws through desert and snow, but he couldn't reach his own daughter across a kitchen table. The scream shattered the morning quiet. Jack grabbed his gun belt and ran outside to find Lucy's horse Duchess thrashing in the corral, her leg tangled in broken fence wire, blood streaming down her foreleg. Lucy stood frozen at the gate, her mouth open in that terrible silent scream that haunted Jack's nightmares. "Get back, Lucy." He tried to approach the mare, but she reared, making the wire cut deeper. "Damn it, easy, girl. Let me help." A woman appeared beside him, brown dress, dark hair escaping from a practical bun, carrying a medical bag. Without waiting for permission, she slipped through the gate, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd faced danger before. Easy, sweetheart, she murmured to Duchess, her voice low and soothing. I know it hurts. I know you're scared, but I can help if you'll let me. The horse's ears flicked toward her. The woman kept talking nonsense words in that gentle tone as she slowly approached. When Duchess finally, still trembling but no longer thrashing, the woman looked back at Jack. I need you to hold her head steady. Can you do that? Jack found himself obeying without question. He watched, transfixed, as the stranger's hands worked with surgical precision, cutting the wire, cleaning the wound. Her movements efficient despite the horse's occasional flinches. Your daughter, the woman said quietly, not looking up from her work. She loves this horse. It wasn't a question, but Jack answered anyway. Duchess was her mother's horse. She doesn't speak anymore. Not since her mother died. The woman's hands paused for just a moment. Grief takes many forms. Sometimes it steals our words. She looked directly at Lucy, who was watching through the fence rails. But love doesn't need words, does it, sweetheart? This horse knows you love her. She's being brave for you. Lucy's eyes went wide. She stepped closer to the fence, her small hands gripping the rails. 20 minutes later, Duchess stood calmly, her leg properly bandaged, already nuzzling Lucy's outstretched hand. The woman packed her medical supplies with the same methodical care she'd shown while treating the wound. Thank you, Jack said, meaning it. I'm Jack Morrison, sheriff here. Elizabeth Thornfield. She hesitated, then added, recently of Philadelphia. You're a nurse. I was trained as one, yes. My father was a doctor. He believed in practical education. Her voice carried weight, stories untold. Jack studied her, the competent hands, the straight spine, despite obvious exhaustion, the way she kept glancing at Lucy with a mixture of recognition and sorrow. You looking for work, Miss Thornfield? I am, but your Mrs. Pritchard made it clear there's no place for Eastern medicine here. Mrs. Pritchard doesn't speak for the whole town. My housekeeper, Helen, just gave notice her arthritis is getting too bad for the work. The job comes with room and board if you're interested. I can't pay much, but does it involve medical work? Elizabeth interrupted. This is a frontier town, Miss Thornfield. Everything involves medical work eventually. She looked at Lucy, who had laid her cheek against Duchess's neck, then back at Jack. When do I start? Helen McCready was not what Elizabeth expected. The elderly housekeeper moved slowly but deliberately, her keen eyes missing nothing as she showed Elizabeth around the Morrison house. It was larger than most in town, 2 stories with real glass windows and wood floors that creaked with memory. Lucy's room, Helen said, stopping at a door covered in charcoal drawings. Child spends most of her time there, or with that horse. Been 3 years since she spoke a word. What was she like before? Helen's face softened. Bright as a button, chattered like a magpie, always asking questions. Why is the sky blue, Mrs. Helen? Where do the stars go in daytime? Then her mama took sick with the fever and Lucy watched her fade away over 3 days. Child tried to call for her papa when Sarah was at her worst, but no sound came out. Hasn't made a sound since. Elizabeth studied the drawings papering the door. They were all variations of the same theme: darkness, loss, isolation. But in the corner of each, barely visible, was a tiny star. She's still in there, Elizabeth said softly. The little girl who asked about stars. Helen gave her a sharp look. You lost someone too. I can see it in your eyes. My father and myself for a while. Well, Helen said, her voice gruff but kind. Maybe you and that child can find yourselves together. That first week, Elizabeth established a routine. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, finding that Lucy would eat if she made the food into shapes, stars, horses, birds. She cleaned and organized while Lucy was at school, learning the house's rhythms and secrets. In the afternoon, she worked with Duchess, letting Lucy watch and gradually help with the care. She also began to notice things. How Jack's hands shook sometimes when he thought no one was looking. How he had nightmares that made him call out names of men who must have died in the war. How he looked at Lucy with a desperation that spoke of a man drowning on dry land. And she noticed the other things too. The way certain men in town watched Jack with calculating eyes. The whispers about the Colton gang getting bolder closer. The deputy, Carl Hayes, who spent too much time at the saloon and not enough time patrolling. One evening as she served dinner, Jack said, "You're not what I expected from a Philadelphia lady." What did you expect? Fainting at the sight of blood. Complaints about the lack of proper society. maybe some tears about the hardship. Elizabeth set down the pot roast with more force than necessary. Sheriff Morrison, I spent 2 years working in a war hospital when I was 16. I've amputated limbs, extracted bullets, and held dying men's hands while they called for their mothers. The frontier doesn't scare me. Men who think they own me, that's what sends me running. Jack's eyes sharpened. Is that why you left Philadelphia? Among other reasons. She met his gaze steadily. Is that a problem? No, ma'am. Running from something doesn't make you a coward. Sometimes it makes you smart. Lucy looked between them, her dark eyes curious. She pointed at Elizabeth, then made a gesture like wings. Bird, Jack guessed. Lucy shook her head, frustrated. She tried again, this time adding a cage-breaking motion. Free bird, Elizabeth said quietly, a bird that escaped its cage. Lucy nodded emphatically, and for the first time since Elizabeth had arrived, she smiled. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching the moon paint the town silver, and thought about cages, the ones we're born into, the ones we build ourselves and the ones we mistake for safety until the door locks behind us. A movement caught her eye. 3 riders on the ridge above town, sitting their horses like shadows against the sky. They watched for a long moment, then melted back into the darkness. The Colton gang. She'd heard enough whispers to know they were trouble, that they'd been circling Redemption Falls like wolves testing a fence. She also knew that Jack was the main reason they hadn't attacked yet. His reputation from his cavalry days still carried weight. She was about to turn away when she saw another figure, Deputy Hayes, slipping out of the saloon's back door, looking up at the ridge where the riders had been. He nodded once as if confirming something, then disappeared into the shadows. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She'd seen that kind of nod before in Philadelphia between men making deals that would destroy lives. Deputy Hayes was working with the Coltons. The next morning, she found Jack in his office, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision, the movement of a soldier preparing for battle. You saw them too, he said without looking up. The riders? Yes. They're getting bolder. Tom Colton thinks he owns this territory. Probably be making a move soon. Elizabeth hesitated, then said, Your deputy was out late last night. Jack's hands stilled. Carl's always been fond of whiskey. Sheriff Morrison, Jack, I don't think he was drinking. Jack looked up, then his eyes hard as flint. You saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying be careful who you trust. In my experience, the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile at you every day. Before Jack could respond, Helen burst through the door, her face white with panic. Sheriff, it's Martha Hayes. She's in labor, and something's wrong. The baby's turned wrong, and she's bleeding. Elizabeth was moving before Helen finished speaking, grabbing her medical bag. Where? The Hayes house, just past the church. I know it. Elizabeth turned to Jack. I need clean water, all you can boil, clean cloths, and whiskey for sterilization. Martha's Carl's wife, Jack said slowly, the implications clear. I don't care whose wife she is. She's a woman in trouble, and I can help. Elizabeth's voice was steel. Are you coming or not? They ran through the streets together, Lucy following despite Jack's protests. The Hayes house was in chaos. Carl pacing the porch, neighbors gathered uselessly, and from inside the terrible sound of a woman in agony. Elizabeth pushed past them all, finding Martha Hayes on a blood-soaked bed, her face gray with pain and blood loss. Everyone out except who I ask for, Elizabeth commanded, already assessing the situation. The baby was breech shoulder presentation, one of the most dangerous positions. Without intervention, both mother and child would die. Mrs. Hayes, Martha, I'm Elizabeth. I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me. Martha's eyes were wild with fear. My baby? Your baby's just confused about which way to come out. We're going to help guide them, all right? Elizabeth looked at Jack. I need you to hold her shoulders. Helen, support her legs. This is going to hurt, but it's going to save her life. What followed was 40 minutes of controlled chaos. Elizabeth worked with fierce concentration, her hands steady despite the blood manually turning the baby, while Martha screamed and Jack held her steady. Carl tried to burst in twice, but Helen, showing surprising strength, barred the door. Come on, little one, Elizabeth murmured, feeling the baby finally shift. That's it. There we go. The baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid, a tiny girl, blue and still. Elizabeth immediately cleared her airways, rubbing her back vigorously while Martha sobbed. "She's not crying," Martha gasped. "Why isn't she crying?" Elizabeth didn't answer, focused entirely on the infant. She breathed into the tiny lungs, compressed. The chest gently breathed again. The room held its breath with her. Then a cough, a wheeze, and finally, gloriously, a cry. "There she is," Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face as she placed the squalling infant on Martha's chest. "There's your fighter." Martha sobbed, clutching her daughter while Elizabeth worked to stop the bleeding, her movements automatic even through her exhaustion. Only when she was certain both mother and child were stable did she step back, blood covering her dress, her hands shaking. Carl burst through the door, falling to his knees beside his wife and child. The big, rough deputy was crying like a baby himself. "You saved them," he said to Elizabeth, his voice breaking. "Dear God, you saved them both." Elizabeth met his eyes steadily. "Everyone deserves a chance at life, Deputy Hayes. Everyone deserves someone who will fight for them when they can't fight for themselves." Something passed through Carl's expression, shame perhaps, or recognition. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she hadn't said. That evening, as Elizabeth washed the blood from her hands in the kitchen, she found Lucy standing in the doorway holding a piece of paper. It was a drawing, but different from her usual dark sketches. This one showed a woman with dark hair holding a baby up to the light, and in the corner, that tiny star had grown larger, brighter. Lucy handed her the drawing, then did something extraordinary. She opened her mouth, and though no sound came out, she clearly mouthed the word hero. Elizabeth pulled the child into her arms, feeling Lucy's thin body shake with silent sobs, not of grief this time, but of something breaking free. "You're the hero, sweetheart," Elizabeth whispered. "You're the bravest little girl I know." Jack stood in the doorway watching them with an expression Elizabeth couldn't read. "You did something today," he said quietly. "Not just saving Martha and the baby. Carl, he came to me after, told me some things about the Coltons, about plans. People make bad choices when they're desperate," Elizabeth said, still holding Lucy. "Sometimes they just need to remember there's another way. You always see the best in people." "No." Elizabeth met his eyes over Lucy's head. "I've seen the worst. That's how I recognize the good when I find it." That night, as the household settled into sleep, Helen sat in her small room off the kitchen, writing a letter by candlelight. Her arthritis made holding the pen painful, but some things had to be done. "Tom," she wrote, "your father would be ashamed. You've become everything he fought against. I've kept your secret all these years. But if you come for this town, if you hurt these good people, I'll tell everyone the truth about who you really are. Your mother's love has limits. Don't test them." She sealed the letter, addressed it to a location only she and one other person knew, then sat back in her chair. Her chest hurt had been hurting more each day, though she'd told no one. The medicine she kept hidden was running low. 20 years ago, she'd given up her son to save him from his father's legacy. She'd changed her name, moved to Redemption Falls, built a new life. But blood called to blood, and Tom had found his way to his father's path anyway, becoming the very thing she'd tried to protect him from: a killer, a thief, a man who preyed on the innocent. She looked at the ceiling toward where Lucy slept. That child had already lost one mother. Helen wouldn't let her lose another, even if it meant betraying her own son. The next few days passed in a strange peace. Martha Hayes recovered, well, the baby thriving. Carl threw himself into his duties with new dedication, actually patrolling instead of drinking. And Lucy, while still silent, began to engage more, helping Elizabeth with medical visits, drawing pictures that contained more light than shadow. Elizabeth was teaching Lucy about medicinal herbs in the garden when Samuel Morrison arrived. She recognized him instantly, not just from his resemblance to Jack, but from his bearing. This was a man who hunted other men for a living, who could read guilt in a glance and truth in a lie. He wore expensive clothes that tried to hide the gun at his hip, but Elizabeth had known enough dangerous men to recognize one. "You must be the miracle worker," Samuel said, tipping his hat. "The runaway bride who's got my brother looking alive again." Elizabeth stood slowly, putting herself between Samuel and Lucy. "And you must be the brother he never mentions." Samuel laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Jack and I had a falling out years ago. Different opinions on justice. He believes in the law. I believe in results." "And what results bring you here now?" A concerned party in Philadelphia hired me to find a missing bride. Seems she disappeared right before her wedding, breaking poor Theodore Blackwood's heart. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice, but she kept her face calm. How tragic for Mr. Blackwood. Indeed, he's quite desperate to find her. Says she stole valuable medical equipment from his stores. Did she now? Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice. Between you and me, Miss Thornfield, I think Theodore Blackwood is a pompous ass who probably deserved to be left at the altar. But he pays well, and I have a reputation to maintain. I see. Do you, because here's what I see. Samuel's voice was conversational, almost friendly. I see a woman who's brought my brother back from the dead. I see a little girl who's starting to heal because of her. I see a town that's rallying around a newcomer who saves lives without asking for anything in return. He paused, studying her face. I also see that my investigation has hit a dead end. The trail went cold in Kansas. Tragic how these things happen. Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled with relief, but she held steady. Mr. Morrison, Samuel, and I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Jack. And for that little girl who deserves a chance at happiness. His expression hardened. But if you hurt them, if you're playing some game, I'm not. No, Samuel said after a long moment. I don't believe you are. Jack appeared around the corner, his face tight with barely controlled anger. Samuel? Hello, little brother. You need to leave. Already going. Samuel tipped his hat to Elizabeth again. Miss Thornfield, it's been a pleasure not finding you. I'll send word to Philadelphia that the trail's gone cold. Theodore will have to find another bride to bore to death with his business talk. He started to leave, then turned back. Jack, you might want to know the Coltons hit the Jackson Ranch last night, took everything. They're moving this way. Jack's hand went to his gun. How many? 7, maybe 8. Tom Colton's leading them himself now. Man seems to have a particular grudge against this town. Samuel glanced at Helen, who had appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Can't imagine why. After Samuel left, Jack turned to Elizabeth. You ran from Theodore Blackwood. You know him. Know of him. He owns half of Philadelphia's medical supplies, has judges in his pocket. You're either very brave or very foolish to run from him. Maybe both. Jack studied her for a moment and then said, Samuel's right, you know, about bringing us back from the dead. Before Elizabeth could respond, Lucy tugged on her father's sleeve, pointing urgently toward town. Smoke was rising from the direction of the bank. Stay here, Jack ordered, already running. But Elizabeth had never been good at following orders. She grabbed her medical bag, told Helen to keep Lucy safe, and followed Jack toward the smoke. The bank wasn't on fire, it was a distraction. While half the town fought the flames from a burning hay wagon, 3 masked men were inside the bank. Jack had already engaged them, gunfire echoing off the buildings. Elizabeth ducked behind a water trough as bullets shattered the window above her head. Through the chaos, she saw Jack pinned down behind an overturned table, blood running down his arm. Then she saw something else. Lucy had followed them, was crouched behind a barrel, terror frozen on her face as a masked man advanced on her father from behind. Time slowed. Elizabeth saw the gun rise toward Jack's back, saw Lucy's mouth open in a silent scream. And without thinking, Elizabeth grabbed a piece of broken timber and swung it with all her strength. The wood connected with the gunman's skull with a sickening crack. He dropped his gun, skittering away. Elizabeth kicked it toward Jack, who spun and fired at the other attackers, driving them back. But one bandit remained, his gun trained on Elizabeth. She saw her death in the black barrel, had a moment to think how ironic it was to die in a wedding dress, and now to die saving someone else's family. The shot was impossibly loud, but it was the bandit who fell, clutching his shoulder. Behind him stood Carl Hayes, his smoking gun still raised. Nobody shoots women in my town, Carl said grimly. Not anymore. The remaining bandits fled, leaving their wounded companion behind. Jack was on his feet, immediately checking Elizabeth for injuries, while Carl secured the prisoner. You're bleeding, Elizabeth said, reaching for Jack's arm. You hit a man with a piece of wood to save me. It seemed like the thing to do at the time. Jack caught her hands, his eyes intense. Elizabeth, Papa. The word cracked through the air like a gunshot. Everyone froze, turning to stare at Lucy, who stood with tears streaming down her face. Papa, she said again, her voice rusty from disuse but clear. You're hurt. Miss Elizabeth, Papa's hurt. Jack fell to his knees, pulling Lucy into his arms while she sobbed, and chattered 3 years of words pouring out in a flood. I tried to talk before, but I couldn't, and then Mama was gone and the words were stuck. But Miss Elizabeth came, and she saved Duchess, and saved Mrs. Hayes, and saved you, and the words came back. Papa, they came back. Elizabeth stood watching them, tears running down her face when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Helen stood beside her, her expression strange. You saved them all, Helen said quietly. We all saved each other. Helen was quiet for a moment, then said, I need to tell you something. About the Coltons. About Tom Colton specifically. Elizabeth saw the pain in the older woman's eyes, the weight of secrets carried too long. Helen, he's my son. The words hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Helen's shoulders shook as she continued. I gave him up 20 years ago, tried to save him from becoming his father. But blood tells, and he found his way to violence anyway. He's coming for this town, and it's my fault. Elizabeth pulled the older woman into her arms. No, his choices are his own. I have to stop him. We'll stop him together. As the sun set over Redemption Falls, casting long shadows across the wounded town, Elizabeth looked at the family she'd found, Jack holding his talking, laughing daughter, Helen carrying the weight of impossible choices, Carl Hayes standing guard with newfound purpose. She'd run from one life straight into another, from a cage of gold into a frontier of possibility. Tomorrow would bring in new challenges. The Coltons were still coming. Theodore might still send others, and hearts once broken were fragile as they mended. But tonight, Lucy was talking. Jack was smiling. And Elizabeth Thornfield, runaway bride and unlikely hero, was exactly where she belonged. The star that had been tiny in Lucy's drawings was growing brighter, and for the first time in years, it wasn't alone in the dark. The revelation hung in the morning air like gun smoke. Helen McCready, the woman who had kept Jack Morrison's house and helped raise his daughter, was mother to the most dangerous outlaw in the territory. Elizabeth stood in the kitchen, watching Helen's weathered hands tremble as she kneaded bread, the repetitive motion a futile attempt at normalcy after her confession the night before. How long have you known he was nearby? Elizabeth asked gently. 6 months. He sent a man to test me, see if I'd recognize him after all these years. Helen's voice was hollow. A mother always knows her child, even when that child has become a monster. You're not responsible for his choices. Aren't I? Helen's hand stilled. I gave him away to protect him from his father's legacy. Told myself a good family would raise him right. But the family I chose, they died when Tom was 10. He ended up on the streets then with outlaws. If I'd kept him, you'd likely both be dead, Jack said from the doorway. Neither woman had heard him approach. His arm was still bandaged from yesterday's gunfight, but he moved with his usual quiet authority. I knew your husband, Helen, knew his reputation. You did what you had to do to survive. Helen's composure finally cracked. His father was evil incarnate Jack. Beat me until I couldn't remember my own name. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew that baby would either become his victim or his weapon. So I ran. And ended up here. Changed my name, my whole history. Been lying to good people for 20 years. She looked at Jack with tears streaming down her face. I'll pack my things. The hell you will, Jack said firmly. You've been more of a grandmother to Lucy than she ever had by blood. Your son's crimes aren't yours to carry. From upstairs came the sound of Lucy's voice, still hoarse from disuse, but growing stronger as she read aloud from one of her mother's old books. The miracle of her return speech had transformed the house, filling it with a prey they had almost forgotten existed. She's reading to Duchess through the window, Elizabeth said with a soft smile. Apparently the horse needs to hear stories too. Jack's expression gentled. She gets that from Sarah. Used to read to all the animals, said they were the best listeners. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Carl Hayes stood on the porch, his deputy badge gleaming in the morning sun, a marked change from the tarnished appearance he'd maintained during his drinking days. Sheriff, we got a problem. Telegram just came in from Fort Laramie. The Coltons hit an Army payroll wagon. Killed 2 soldiers. Jack's face darkened. Federal crime now. They'll send marshals. That's not the worst part. Carl handed Jack the telegram. They're saying Tom Colton left a message. Said he's coming for Redemption Falls next, and specifically mentioned you. Elizabeth read over Jack's shoulder, her blood chilling at the words. Tell Morrison his debt is coming due. 3 days. What debt? Elizabeth asked. Jack's jaw tightened. 5 years ago, before I was sheriff here, I tracked Tom's gang for the cavalry. Caught 3 of his men, including his younger brother. They hanged for murder. Helen made a sound like a wounded animal. Jamie's dead. You knew Tom's brother? Elizabeth asked. I had 2 sons. Helen's confession came out in a whisper. Tom was the elder. Jamie was born 2 years later. I managed to keep Jamie longer, hide him from his father until he was 5. Then she touched her ribs, her old pain flickering across her face. After the beating that nearly killed me, I gave Jamie to the sisters at St. Catherine's. Told them his father was dead, mother too poor to keep him. The kitchen fell silent except for Lucy's distant reading and the tick of the clock. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Helen, I'm sorry. If I'd known. You did your job. Jamie chose his path, same as Tom. Helen straightened steel, returning to her spine. But Tom blames you for Jamie's death, and he'll burn this whole town to punish you for it. Not if I stop him first. How? Carl asked. We've got maybe 6 able-bodied men who can shoot worth a damn. The Coltons have at least 8, maybe more. Then we need to be smarter. Elizabeth moved to the window, studying the town's layout. In Philadelphia, my father once told me about the war, how smaller forces could defeat larger ones with preparation and knowledge of terrain. Your father was military? Jack asked. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. Before he was a doctor, he served as a field medic for the Union, but he started as a tactical advisor. Said medicine and warfare both required understanding your enemy's weaknesses. And what's Tom Colton's weakness? Carl asked. Helen answered quietly, pride. He can't stand being made to look foolish. It's why he announces his targets, why he leaves messages. He needs everyone to know how powerful he is. Then we use that against him, Elizabeth said. Make him come to us on our terms. Jack studied her with something like admiration. You're not just a nurse, are you? I'm whatever I need to be to protect the people I care about. Before anyone could respond, Lucy burst into the kitchen, her face bright with excitement. Papa? Miss Elizabeth, there's a man outside with the biggest horses I've ever seen. He says he knows you. They rushed to the porch to find Samuel Morrison standing beside a wagon loaded with wooden crates, 4 magnificent draft horses stamping in the traces. Thought you might need some supplies, Samuel said casually, though his eyes were sharp as he scanned the town. Heard the Coltons were heading this way. Samuel, Jack said warily, what's in the crates? Oh, this and that. Ammunition, some new rifles from back east, maybe a few sticks of dynamite that fell off an army wagon. Samuel grinned. All legally purchased, of course. I have receipts. You came back to help. I came back because family stands together even when that family's complicated. Samuel's gaze found Elizabeth. Besides, someone needs to make sure Miss Thornfield's investment in this town pays off. Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. I haven't invested. Sure you have. You invested your skills, your courage, your heart. Samuel's expression grew serious. Theodore Blackwood sent another detective, by the way. But don't worry, I had a conversation with him about the dangers of frontier travel. He decided California might be better for his health. That evening they gathered in the church, the entire town, all 43 souls, who called Redemption Falls home. Jack stood at the pulpit, Elizabeth and Samuel flanking him, while Carl guarded the door. You all know what's coming, Jack began. The Coltons want this town and they want blood. We can run, let them take what they want, and hope they leave us breathing. Or we can fight. Fighting suicide, said Walter Pritchard, the store owner's husband. We're shopkeepers and ranchers, not gunfighters. You're right, Elizabeth stepped forward, which is why we're not going to fight them straight on. We're going to be smarter. She moved to the chalkboard the Sunday school used. How many of you have root cellars? Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Root cellars, storm shelters, any underground space. How many hands slowly raised? Elizabeth made notes on the board mapping the town's hidden spaces. And how many of you hunt set traps for rabbits or coyotes? More hands. Good. Elizabeth's smile was sharp as a scalpel, because we're going to turn Redemption Falls into a trap. The Coltons expect scared townsfolk. They'll find something else entirely. Old Martha Hayes stood up, still weak from childbirth, but with fire in her eyes. This woman saved my life and my baby's. If she says we can do this, I believe her. The Coltons killed my brother last spring, added Thomas the blacksmith. I'll do whatever it takes. One by one, the townspeople voiced their support. Even Mrs. Pritchard, who'd been so dismissive of Elizabeth initially, stood up. I was wrong about you, Miss Thornfield. You're one of us now. We stand together or fall together. Jack watched Elizabeth organize the town's defense with the same precision she'd shown in medical work. She assigned teams, some to dig concealed pits along the main road, others to string wire between buildings at neck height for mounted riders, still others to position mirrors for signaling. Where did you really learn all this? Jack asked her privately as they supervised the work. I told you about the war hospital. What I didn't mention was that it was behind enemy lines. We had to defend ourselves more than once. Elizabeth's eyes grew distant. I was 17 when I killed my first man. He was trying to steal medical supplies while wounded soldiers were dying for lack of them. I didn't hesitate. That why you really ran from Theodore because he found out? No. Elizabeth turned to face him fully. I ran because Theodore was exactly the kind of man who would have used that information to control me. He collected people's secrets like weapons. Okay, Jack reached out, almost touching her face before catching himself. Elizabeth, Sheriff, Carl's voice cracked through the moment. Rider coming in fast. The rider was a boy, maybe 14, riding hard from the direction of the Jackson Ranch. His horse was lathered with sweat, sides heaving. They're coming, the boy gasped. The Coltons, they're at our place now. Pa sent me to warn you. They'll be here by tomorrow noon. Tomorrow, less than 24 hours to finish their preparations. Get the boy water and food, Jack ordered. Carl, ring the church bell. Everyone to positions. As the bell tolled, Elizabeth found Helen in the kitchen, writing another letter with shaking hands. What are you doing? Writing my confession, everything. Who Tom really is, who I really am. If I die tomorrow, the truth should be known. Elizabeth gently took the pen from her hand. You're not dying tomorrow. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Because I need you alive to teach Lucy about herbs. And Jack needs you to keep making that cornbread he pretends not to love, and this town needs your strength. Elizabeth gripped Helen's shoulders. Your son made his choices. You don't owe him your life. Helen's tears came freely then, and Elizabeth held her while she sobbed, not for the man Tom had become, but for the boy he'd never been allowed to be. That night, as the town made final preparations, Elizabeth found herself standing in Sarah Morrison's sewing room, looking at the dresses that still hung in the wardrobe. She would have liked you, Jack said from the doorway. You don't have to say that. I'm not. Sarah believed in strength that didn't announce itself, courage that looked like kindness. She would have seen herself in you. Elizabeth turned to find Jack standing closer than expected, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Tomorrow, she began. Tomorrow we survive. All of us. He cupped her face in his hands. I need you to know something. These past weeks, watching you with Lucy, seeing you bring this town together, I've been falling in love with you. Not because you remind me of Sarah, but because you're entirely yourself. Fierce and gentle and absolutely refusing to be anything less than exactly who you are. Elizabeth's breath caught. Jack, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know in case. She silenced him by pressing her lips to his, a kiss that was answer and promise and plea at once. When they parted, she whispered, we're going to survive this. And when we do, I'm going to marry you properly. No running this time. Is that a proposal, Miss Thornfield? It's a promise, Sheriff Morrison. Lucy's voice called from downstairs. Papa, Miss Elizabeth, the mirrors are all in place. They pulled apart the moment broken, but the promise lingering between them like smoke. The night passed too quickly. Elizabeth barely slept, running through contingencies, checking medical supplies, preparing for casualties. At dawn, she found Lucy sitting by Duchess's stall, her mother's old rifle across her lap. Sweetheart, you're supposed to be in the safe room with the other children. I can shoot, Lucy said quietly. Mama taught me before she died. Said a woman on the frontier should know how to protect herself. You're 11 years old, and you were 17 when you first killed someone. At Elizabeth's shocked look, Lucy added, "The walls are thin. I heard you talking to Papa." Elizabeth sat beside the girl who'd become like a daughter to her. "Killing changes you, Lucy. Even when it's necessary, even when it's right. It leaves a mark. Being silent for 3 years left a mark too, but you helped me heal from that." Lucy looked up at her with two wise eyes. "Maybe after this is over, we can help each other heal from whatever marks we carry." Elizabeth pulled Lucy close, breathing in the scent of her hair soap and sunshine and childhood stubbornness. "You stay with the others unless absolutely necessary. Promise me." "I promise to be smart," Lucy said, which wasn't quite the same thing. At 11 o'clock, the scouts reported dust clouds approaching from the west. The Coltons were early. Elizabeth took her position on the roof of the general store medical bag beside her rifle in her hands. She could see Jack at the sheriff's office, Samuel and Carl flanking him. Helen was in the church with the children and elderly, though Elizabeth suspected the woman had a gun hidden in her apron. The town looked deserted just as planned. Window-shuttered streets empty except for a few tumbleweeds they'd strategically placed for effect. Tom Colton rode in at the head of 8 men just as predicted. He was younger than Elizabeth expected, maybe 30, with Helen's bone structure twisted into cruel lines. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, arrogant in his confidence. "Jack Morrison," Tom's voice carried across the silent town. "You took my brother from me. Time to pay that debt." Jack stepped out, hands easy at his sides. "Your brother was a murderer, Tom. He killed a family of homesteaders, including 2 children. They were squatting on land that should have been ours. No land is worth children's lives." Tom laughed ugly and sharp. "Everything has a price, Sheriff. Even justice. Where's your town? They abandon you already. They're smart enough to avoid unnecessary bloodshed." "Smart or cowardly?" Tom dismounted his men, spreading out behind him. "Doesn't matter. We'll take what we want either way. Starting with your life, then your daughter." Heard the little mute finally found her voice. "Wonder what sounds she'll make when—" The shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Tom's hat flew off, a neat hole punched through the crown. He spun, looking for the shooter, but the mirrors positioned around town reflected sunlight in blinding flashes, making it impossible to locate the source. "That was a warning," Elizabeth called out, though her voice seemed to come from 3 different directions thanks to the echo chambers they'd created. "The next one won't miss." Tom's men raised their weapons, but suddenly the ground gave way beneath 2 of them, the concealed pits Elizabeth had designed in claiming their first victims. The men screamed as they fell onto sharpened stakes below. "Now," Jack shouted. The town erupted. Gunfire from a dozen hidden positions, townsfolk shooting from root cellars and false walls. The tripwires claimed another rider, sending him crashing into a water barrel filled with tar that Thomas the blacksmith had heated. But the Coltons were experienced fighters. They regrouped quickly, taking cover, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Walter Pritchard cried out as a bullet found his shoulder. Elizabeth saw Martha Hayes drag him to safety while her husband Carl advanced on the outlaw's position. Then she saw Lucy. The girl had broken her promise, was creeping along the roofline with her mother's rifle, trying to get a clear shot at Tom Colton. Elizabeth's heart stopped as one of the outlaws spotted her, raising his gun toward the child. Time slowed. Elizabeth moved without thinking, launching herself across the gap between buildings. She crashed into Lucy just as the bullet whistled past both of them, tumbling onto the slanted roof. The rifle skittered away, sliding toward the edge. "I had the shot," Lucy cried, "and he had you." Elizabeth pushed Lucy toward the roof hatch. "Get below now." But Tom Colton had seen them. He was climbing the building, murder in his eyes. Elizabeth grabbed Lucy's fallen rifle, but it was empty. Tom hauled himself onto the roof, gun drawn. "Well, well, the runaway bride and the sheriff's brat." Elizabeth pushed Lucy behind her. "Your fight's with the adults, not children." "My brother was barely 19 when Morrison had him hanged, still a child into my eyes." Tom's gun steadied on Elizabeth. "Eye for an eye." "Tom, no." Helen stood at the edge of the roof, having climbed the ladder no one thought she could manage with her arthritis. She held an old Navy Colt, the kind used 20 years ago. "Mother," Tom's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Hello, son." The gunfight below seemed to pause, everyone aware something momentous was happening on the rooftop. "You're dead," Tom whispered. "Father said you died." "Your father said a lot of things. All of them lies." Helen stepped closer, her gun never wavering. I've watched you become everything I tried to save you from, everything your father was. You abandoned me. I tried to save you, gave you to a good family, who died leaving me with nothing but his name and his gun. Tom's face contorted with rage and pain. You should have kept me. Your father would have killed us both. Instead, the world tried to kill me alone, and I got strong, I got mean. I survived. No, Helen said sadly. You died inside and just kept walking. Tom's gun swung toward his mother. Then you can join me in hell. 3 shots fired simultaneously. Tom's bullet caught Helen in the chest, spinning her backward. Elizabeth's borrowed derringer hidden in her medical bag put a hole in Tom's shoulder. But it was the 3rd shot from Jack's rifle below that ended Tom Colton's reign of terror. Tom looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then at his mother collapsed on the roof. Mama, the word came out small, confused, like the boy he'd once been. Helen, bleeding and dying, reached out to her son. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Tom crawled to her, his strength fading. Mother and son lay together and on the roof as their blood mingled on the shingles, 20 years of separation ending in a moment of terrible reunion. Did you ever love me? Tom whispered. Every day. Helen gasped. Every single day. Tom Colton died with his head on his mother's shoulder, the outlaw finally finding the peace that had eluded him in life. Helen lingered a moment longer, her eyes finding Elizabeth. Take care of them, she whispered. Then she too was gone. The remaining Colton gang, seeing their leader fall, tried to flee, but Samuel and the townsmen cut them down or captured them. In 15 minutes of chaos, it was over. Elizabeth knelt beside Helen and Tom Lucy, clinging to her back. Below, Jack was climbing the ladder, his face grim. The town had won, but at a cost. She saved us, Elizabeth said quietly, both of them in their own way. Tom's death ends the gang, and Helen's sacrifice. She couldn't finish. Jack pulled both Elizabeth and Lucy into his arms. She died protecting her real family, the one she chose. As they stood on the roof, the sun broke through the gun smoke, illuminating Redemption Falls. The town had lived up to its name, redemption found in sacrifice, in choosing love over fear, in standing together against the darkness. But Elizabeth knew the real redemption was quieter, smaller. It was in Lucy's voice returning, in Jack's smile, in Helen's final act of love for a son she couldn't save, in a family she could. They climbed down from the roof to find the town gathering. Martha Hayes was tending the wounded with Elizabeth's medical supplies, having learned from watching her. Carl stood guard over the captured outlaws. Samuel was already organizing the cleanup. Miss Thornfield, Mrs. Pritchard approached hesitantly. What you did today, we owe you everything. You owe me nothing. We protected each other. That's what family does. Mrs. Pritchard smiled through her tears. Welcome home, Elizabeth. Welcome home. That night, they buried Helen and Tom side by side in the cemetery outside town. It seemed wrong to separate them after everything. Reverend Cole, brought in from the neighboring town, spoke words about forgiveness and redemption that made everyone cry. Lucy sang a hymn in her clear young voice, the first time she'd sung since her mother's death. The sound was so pure, so beautiful, that even the wind seemed to pause to listen. Spring came to Redemption Falls like a blessing, after a curse washing the blood from memory, if not from fact. 3 months had passed since the Colton raid, and the town bore its scars with quiet dignity. Bullet holes in walls became strange decorations. The rebuilt bank stood stronger than before, and Helen McCready's grave sprouted wildflowers that Lucy tended every Sunday. Elizabeth stood in her makeshift clinic, teaching Martha Hayes how to properly suture a wound. The woman had shown remarkable aptitude for medical work since helping during the raid, and Elizabeth had taken her on as an informal apprentice. Smaller stitches? Elizabeth guided Martha's hands. Think of it like embroidery, but the fabric is saving someone's life. Never thought I'd be doing this, Martha said, concentration furrowing her brow. Carl says I'm getting better at it than cooking. You have steady hands and a steady heart. That's what matters. The clinic door burst open, causing both women to jump. Lucy ran in braids, flying her face bright with excitement. Miss Elizabeth, Papa says to come quick. There's a fancy carriage coming into town. Elizabeth's blood chilled. In her experience, fancy carriages brought nothing but trouble to frontier towns. She grabbed her medical bag out of habit and followed Lucy to the main street where half the town had already gathered. The carriage was indeed fancy black lacquered wood with gold trim pulled by four matched grays that must have cost more than most folks saw in a lifetime. Jack stood in front of the sheriff's office, hand resting casually on his gun, though Elizabeth could see the tension in his shoulders. The carriage door opened, and Theodore Blackwood stepped out. Elizabeth's world tilted. He looked exactly the same immaculate black suit, perfectly trimmed. Beard, cold eyes that possessed everything they surveyed. Behind him emerged a younger woman in an expensive traveling dress, and Elizabeth's heart sank further. His new bride, no doubt. Come to gloat. But then Theodore's eyes found hers, and his expression wasn't triumphant. It was complicated. "Miss Thornfield," he said, removing his hat. "Or should I say Mrs. Morrison?" "Not yet," Elizabeth said steadily, though her pulse hammered. "The wedding's next month." "Ah." Theodore glanced at Jack, took in the protective stance the ready violence barely contained. "Sheriff Morrison, I presume. I've heard a great deal about you." "Can't say the same," Jack replied coolly. "State your business, Blackwood." Theodore helped the woman from the carriage, and Elizabeth realized with a start that she wasn't his bride. She was barely 18 with Theodore's same sharp features. "This is my daughter, Catherine," Theodore said, "and we've come to make amends." The silence stretched until Lucy, with a child's directness, said, "You're the man who tried to make Miss Elizabeth marry you." "I am," Theodore admitted, looking down at the fierce little girl. "And I was wrong." Mrs. Pritchard actually gasped. Theodore Blackwood, one of Philadelphia's richest men, admitting wrong. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere private," Theodore suggested. Jack looked at Elizabeth, leaving the decision to her. She nodded slowly. "The sheriff's office." Inside, with Jack standing guard and Lucy refusing to leave Elizabeth's side, Theodore sat heavily in a chair. Up close, Elizabeth could see he'd aged more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. "You look well, Elizabeth," he said quietly. "Happy." "I am, no thanks to you." "No, indeed." Theodore pulled out a leather portfolio. "I've come to make things right as much as I can. First this." He handed her a document. Elizabeth read it, her eyes widening. "This is a legal statement absolving you of any debts, real or imagined, related to your father's estate. Additionally, it transfers ownership of his medical equipment, all of it, to you properly." "I don't understand." Theodore's daughter, Catherine, spoke for the first time, her voice cultured but warm. "Father's been quite horrible since you left. Drinking, raging, making everyone miserable. Mother finally had enough." "Catherine," Theodore warned. "No, Father, she deserves the truth." Catherine turned to Elizabeth. "Mother left him, took half his fortune and moved to Boston. Said she'd wasted 20 years on a man who couldn't love anything he couldn't own." Theodore flinched. "The divorce was illuminating. It made me realize what I'd become, what I'd tried to do to you." "So you came all this way for absolution?" Elizabeth's voice was sharp. "No, I came for this." Theodore pulled out another document. "Your father left more than debts, Elizabeth. He had patents on several medical instruments, innovations that are only now being recognized. They're worth a considerable sum." Elizabeth took the papers with trembling hands. The amount listed was enough to build a proper hospital to bring real medical care to the frontier. "Why?" she asked. "Because I was wrong. Because your father was brilliant, and his daughter inherited that brilliance. Because—" Theodore stood suddenly, looking older and smaller. "Because I loved your father like a brother once before pride and greed poisoned everything. This is my attempt at honoring his memory properly." Catherine added softly, "Also because father's trying to win mother back, and she said he had to make amends for all his wrongs first." "Catherine," Theodore protested, but there was a hint of a smile. Elizabeth looked at the documents, then at Jack, who'd remained silent throughout. He gave her a small nod, her choice as always. "I accept," Elizabeth said finally. "Not for you, but for this town. We need a real hospital." Theodore stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Elizabeth, you were right to run. I would have destroyed everything good in you, trying to make you fit my world." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed simply. "You would have." As Theodore and Catherine prepared to leave, the younger woman pressed something into Elizabeth's hand, a small photograph. "Your father," Catherine whispered. "From when he and my father were young, before everything went wrong." The photograph showed two young men, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the confidence of those who believe they'll change the world. Elizabeth traced her father's face with one finger, seeing him happy for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered. After the Blackwoods left, the town was abuzz with gossip and speculation. Elizabeth ignored it all, focused on something far more important, planning a hospital that would serve not just Redemption Falls, but all the surrounding territory. That evening, she found Jack on their favorite spot, the hill overlooking the town where they could see the sun paint the mountains gold. "That was unexpected," Jack said. "The money changes everything. We could bring in a real doctor, build proper facilities." "We could," Jack turned to her, "or you could go back east. With that money, that legal clearance, you could attend medical school properly. Become the doctor you should have been." Elizabeth stared at him. "You'd let me go." "I'd hate it. Lucy would be devastated. But I'd never cage you, Elizabeth. Never." She kissed him, then fierce and sure. "Jack Morrison, you beautiful fool. Don't you understand I am exactly where I want to be? This is my home. You and Lucy are my family. The only thing that money changes is how much good I can do right here. You're sure what? I've never been more sure of anything in my life." 2 weeks later, Samuel Morrison returned to town with a surprise, an actual qualified doctor he'd convinced to come west. Dr. Marcus Chen was young Chinese and brilliant. He'd faced discrimination in San Francisco despite his degree from Harvard Medical School, and Samuel had offered him something irresistible, a place where his skills mattered more than his race. "You'll work with Elizabeth," Samuel explained to the skeptical townspeople. "She knows frontier medicine. He knows formal training. Together, they'll save more lives than either could alone." Mrs. Pritchard predictably was the most resistant. "A Chinese doctor. What's next?" "Progress," Elizabeth said firmly. "Dr. Chen graduated top of his class. He's published papers on surgical techniques that are revolutionary. We're lucky to have him." To everyone's surprise, it was Lucy who settled the matter. She walked right up to Dr. Chen and said in perfect Mandarin, "Welcome to our home. Mrs. Helen taught me before she died." Dr. Chen's face transformed with surprised delight. He responded in Mandarin, then English. "Your accent is very good. Mrs. Helen must have been an excellent teacher." "She was," Lucy said simply. "She said understanding different people made us bigger on the inside." Within a month, Dr. Chen had won over even the skeptics, especially after he saved Thomas the blacksmith's hand when an accident nearly severed it. Elizabeth worked beside him as an equal, learning and teaching in turn. The new hospital was being built with Theodore's money and the town's labor. Everyone contributed what they could, time, material, skills. It would have 6 beds, a surgical room, and quarters for medical staff. "It's really happening," Martha Hayes said, watching the frame go up. "A real hospital in Redemption Falls." "Helen would be proud," Elizabeth said softly. "She is proud," Lucy corrected, pointing to the wildflowers blooming impossibly early around the construction site. "She's watching." The wedding was set for a Saturday in May. Elizabeth had initially wanted something simple, just family and a few friends, but the entire town had other ideas. "You saved us all," Clara Whitman insisted, having arrived from her ranch specifically to help. "We're all going to be there to see you properly married." Elizabeth stood in Sarah's old sewing room, now hers, looking at the wedding dress Mrs. Pritchard and the other women had made for her. It was simple but beautiful, cream-colored with small blue flowers embroidered on the sleeves. Nothing like the elaborate monstrosity she'd fled in. "You don't have to wear white," Mrs. Pritchard had said. "Not after everything." "Good," Elizabeth had replied. "White was never my color anyway." Lucy burst in, already dressed in her own new dress, blue, to match the embroidery on Elizabeth's. "Mama Lizzie, you look beautiful." The name had evolved over the past weeks from Miss Elizabeth to Mama Elizabeth to Mama Lizzie. Each version made Elizabeth's heart fuller. "So do you, sweetheart. Is your papa ready?" Uncle Samuel's trying to tie his tie and saying bad words. Elizabeth laughed. Samuel had arrived the night before with an unexpected guest, Judge Harrison from Denver, who'd specifically requested to perform the ceremony. "I heard about your town's stand against the Coltons," the judge had said. "About a woman who organized the defense and a sheriff who stood against impossible odds. I wanted to be part of your happy ending." "It's not an ending," Elizabeth had corrected. "It's a beginning." Now walking down the aisle of the church filled with everyone she'd come to love, Elizabeth thought about beginnings and endings, about the terrified woman who'd run through a storm in a ruined wedding dress, and the woman she'd become. Jack waited at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit, but smiling in a way that made her heart race. Samuel stood as his best man, while Lucy insisted on being Elizabeth's maid of honor, despite Martha Hayes also standing with her. Judge Harrison began the ceremony with unexpected words. "We gather today to witness not just a union, but a triumph. Two people who found each other not in perfect circumstances, but in perfect timing, who chose love when life had given them every reason to choose fear." When it came time for vows, Jack spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. "Elizabeth, you walked into my life when I'd forgotten how to hope. You brought my daughter back to me, gave her voice and joy again. You saved my town, my friends, my own stubborn soul. I promise to never cage you, never dim your light, and to stand beside you in whatever battles come. You are my redemption, my resurrection, and my future." Elizabeth had to wipe her eyes before she could speak. "Jack, you offered me shelter when I had nothing but fear and determination. You saw my strength when others saw only scandal. You gave me a daughter to love, a home to defend, and a purpose greater than survival. I promise to choose you every day to be your partner in all things, and to love you and Lucy with every breath I have. You are my safe harbor, my true north, and my home." Lucy tugged on Elizabeth's dress. "Can I say something?" Judge Harrison smiled. "I think that would be perfect." Lucy looked up at both of them, her voice clear and strong. "Mama Sarah once told me that families aren't just about blood. They're about choosing to stay even when it's hard. Papa, you stayed when I couldn't talk. Mama Lizzie, you stayed when bad men came. Now we all stay together forever. That's our family." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. "By the power vested in me," Judge Harrison said, his own voice thick, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sheriff Morrison, kiss your bride." The kiss was sweet and sure, a promise sealed not just between two people, but among three. Lucy wrapped her arms around both of them, and the church erupted in cheers. The reception was held in the new hospital, still unfinished, but decorated with wildflowers and lanterns. Theodore Blackwood had sent champagne from Philadelphia with a note: "To new beginnings and old wrongs made right." Chen played a violin someone had found in the general store's back room, revealing yet another surprising talent. Carl and Martha Hayes danced with their baby daughter between them. Even Mrs. Pritchard was seen smiling, especially after several glasses of champagne. Samuel gave a toast that made everyone laugh. "My brother was the responsible one, the lawman the hero. I was the scoundrel." But Elizabeth turned him into a bit of a scoundrel, too. Anyone who organizes a town to fight outlaws with mirrors and pit traps has a wonderful devious streak. Here's to the couple who proved that sometimes the best families are the ones we build from broken pieces. As the night wore on, Elizabeth found herself standing outside looking at the stars. The same stars she'd seen that terrified night on the train, running from one life toward another. Jack found her there, pulling her back against his chest. "Regrets? Never. You. Only that Sarah couldn't meet you. She would have loved you so much. She did meet me in a way. Through Lucy. Through you. Through this whole town she helped build with her kindness." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Inside, the party continued, their chosen family, celebrating not just a wedding, but survival, redemption, and the peculiar magic of finding love when you're not looking for it. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked. "About that first night, when I walked into your barn desperate and terrified and found you with Duchess. I thought I was saving your horse." "Weren't you?" "No, you were saving me, giving me a purpose when I needed one most." "We saved each other," Jack corrected. "That's what family does." A small hand slipped into Elizabeth's. Lucy escaped from the party. "The stars are pretty tonight," Lucy said. "They are," Elizabeth agreed. "Mrs. Helen told me once that the stars are holes in heaven where the people we love peek through to watch us." So that's a beautiful thought. Lucy pointed to a particularly bright star. "That one's Mama Sarah, and that one's Mrs. Helen. They're probably friends now, watching us be happy." Jack lifted Lucy onto his shoulders so she could be closer to the stars. "What do you think they're saying?" Lucy considered carefully. Mama Sarah saying she's glad Papa found someone strong enough to handle him, and Mrs. Helen saying the cornbread better not burn just because she's gone. They laughed, the three of them, standing together under the vast Montana sky. Tomorrow would bring challenges: the hospital to finish patients, to treat a town, to continue building. There would be harsh winters and dry summers, sickness and health, joy and sorrow. But tonight they were complete, a family forged not from perfection, but from choosing each other when life gave them every reason not to. A sheriff who'd lost his voice to grief and found it again in love. A woman who'd run from a cage and found freedom and commitment. A child who'd been silent and now sang. Elizabeth thought about the woman in the wedding dress running through the rain, desperate and afraid. If she could tell that woman one thing, it would be this: run. Run fast and far, and don't look back. Because every step away from what's wrong is a step toward what's right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, what's right is a man who sees your strength, a child who needs your love, and a town that becomes your home. "Let's go back inside," Jack said. "Our family's waiting." Our family. The words settled in Elizabeth's chest like coming home. They walked back into the hospital-turned dance hall, Lucy still on Jack's shoulders, Elizabeth's hand in his. The townspeople cheered their return, and Dr. Chen started playing a waltz. As Jack spun her around the makeshift dance floor, Elizabeth caught sight of their reflection in the window, not the desperate runaway bride or the broken sheriff, but two people who'd chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Jack replied. "Thank you for running to us. Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running." The music played on, and Redemption Falls danced with them, celebrating not just a wedding, but the proof that sometimes the best endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Later, much later, when the guests had gone home and Lucy was asleep between them because she insisted on staying close on their wedding night, and how could they refuse? Elizabeth lay awake thinking about Helen's sacrifice, Sarah's legacy, Theodore's redemption, and her father's instruments, now serving frontier families. Every ending had led to this beginning. Every loss had cleared space for new love. Every scar had become a story of survival. "Can't sleep," Jack whispered in the darkness. "Too happy to sleep." "That's a good problem to have. The best problem." Lucy stirred between them, mumbling in her sleep. "Stars are singing." "Listen," Jack said softly. "She's right." And perhaps she was. Perhaps the stars were singing a song of redemption, of love found in unlikely places, of families built from choice rather than chance. Or perhaps it was just the wind through the mountains, the eternal music of the frontier that had drawn desperate souls west for generations. Either way, Elizabeth Morrison no longer, Thornfield no longer. Running, closed her eyes and listened to the music of her new life, her husband's breathing, her daughter's dreams, and the steady beat of her own heart, finally at peace. The sheriff's runaway bride had found her home at last, not in a place, but in the people who'd chosen to love her when she'd barely learned to love herself. And that, she knew, was the greatest redemption of all. Outside, dawn was breaking over Redemption Falls, painting the sky in shades of hope. A new day for a new family built on the unshakable foundation of choosing to stay when running would be easier, choosing to love when loss had taught them fear, choosing to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. The beginning of their real story started now.